Long before the first scream echoed through the warp, before stars dimmed and souls were swallowed whole, there was only longing. Quiet at first, almost innocent, a soft pull in the mind, a gentle urge toward pleasure, beauty, perfection. It did not arrive as a monster. It did not announce itself with fire or blood. It arrived as a feeling, subtle, intoxicating, endlessly persuasive. And that feeling would one day be called Slaanesh. To understand Slaanesh, you must forget the idea of evil as something loud and obvious. This story does not begin with armies clashing or gods waging war. It begins in silence, in comfort, in abundance, in a time when suffering was distant and restraint felt unnecessary. When desire was not a weakness but a celebration. When satisfaction was never quite enough, and perfection always seemed just one step further away. In the vast and ancient galaxy of Warhammer 40,000, there are many gods born of violence, decay, and ambition. Yet Slaanesh stands apart, not because of greater cruelty, but because of intimacy. Slaanesh does not conquer worlds through force. Slaanesh waits, watches, listens, feeds on what already exists inside the mind and heart. Every craving indulged, every boundary crossed, every sensation chased just a little too far becomes a whispered prayer. This is not a story about a god descending from the heavens. It is a story about a god being invited into existence. There was a time when the galaxy was quiet in a different way. When the stars were not yet choked by endless war. When one civilization stood above all others, radiant and untouchable. They were immortal by comparison, brilliant beyond measure, masters of art, science, and psychic power. They had defeated extinction itself. Hunger, disease, and fear no longer ruled their lives. And in that triumph, they believed they had transcended consequence. They were the Eldar. To fall asleep to this story is not to escape it, but to drift gently into its rhythm, to follow the slow turning of fate as it moves, patiently and without mercy. Because Slaanesh was not born in a moment of panic. Slaanesh was born over millennia of comfort, over generations of indulgence, over countless decisions that felt harmless at the time. Desire is never loud when it begins. At first, it whispers. It suggests. It promises improvement, a sharper sensation, a deeper pleasure, a more perfect experience. It tells you that you deserve more, that you have earned excess, that limitation is an outdated concept meant for lesser beings. And when no one suffers immediately, when nothing breaks all at once, desire feels justified. The Eldar did not wake up one day and choose damnation. They woke up each day choosing fulfillment. In the warp, the realm of emotion, thought, and psychic reflection, every feeling leaves a mark. Joy ripples outward. Fear leaves scars. Rage burns like wildfire. For millions of years, the Eldar had shaped the warp with discipline and purpose. Their gods were reflections of balance, war, and survival. But as discipline faded and excess grew, something new began to form. Not a god yet, not even a mind, just pressure, density, a gathering of sensation without shape. Imagine an ocean growing heavier with every unrestrained thought, every indulgence sinking into its depths, every obsession adding weight. No single drop matters, but together, they become something immense, something inevitable. The Eldar felt safe. They had no reason not to. Their empire spanned the stars. Their enemies were dust and memory. Their technology bordered on the miraculous. Their lives stretched so long that urgency became meaningless. And without urgency, desire filled the void. Art became more extreme, pleasure more refined, emotion more intense. What once satisfied no longer did. Perfection is a dangerous word. To seek perfection is to accept that nothing is ever enough. And in that endless pursuit, satisfaction becomes impossible. The Eldar chased sensation not because they were empty, but because they were full, and wanted more. More beauty, more feeling, more meaning, more experience. And with every step forward, the line between joy and obsession blurred. Some among them sensed the shift. Philosophers, seers, quiet minds who listened not to pleasure, but to silence. They spoke of imbalance, of echoes in the warp, of something forming beyond perception. But their warnings were soft, and indulgence was loud. Why fear consequences when the present feels infinite? Slaanesh was still unborn then. Still nameless. Still only a shadow cast by a civilization staring into its own reflection. And yet, something was listening. As you settle into this story, let the pace slow. Let the weight of time stretch. This is not a tale that rushes toward its ending. It drifts, the way decadence drifts. Comfortably, seductively, without resistance. The fall did not begin with terror. It began with pleasure. And the most unsettling truth of all is this. If desire can give birth to a god, then no soul is ever truly safe. This is the entire history of Slaanesh. And this is how it begins. Imagine a species so advanced that survival is no longer a concern, where hunger, disease, and extinction have been erased not by luck, but by mastery. A civilization that does not merely live among the stars, but shapes them. Before Slaanesh had a name, before desire curdled into damnation, there existed an empire so vast and refined that it believed itself untouchable. To understand the birth of a god, we must first understand the perfection that made that birth possible. Stay with this story until the very end, because hidden within the rise of the Eldar is a quiet warning, one that does not belong only to them, but to every thinking mind that has ever chased satisfaction without limits. Long before humanity crawled from the mud of old Earth, the Eldar ruled the galaxy. They were not conquerors in the crude sense, nor were they desperate survivors clinging to existence. They were heirs to an age shaped by cosmic war, veterans of a universe-spanning conflict known as the War in Heaven. That ancient war had shattered gods, scarred reality, and left the warp forever changed. When it ended, the Eldar remained, scarred, but victorious. And in that victory, they inherited a galaxy emptied of true rivals. Time passed. Millennia became eras. Eras became legends. The Eldar rebuilt not out of necessity, but ambition. Their technology flowed seamlessly with their psychic gifts. Thought and creation were intertwined. To an Eldar mind, reality was not something to endure, but something to sculpt. Entire worlds were shaped into paradises. Art was not decoration, but transcendence. Every sense could be heightened, refined, perfected. And when a species lives long enough without fear, fear is replaced by curiosity. At first, the Eldar sought knowledge, then experience, then sensation. They explored emotion the way explorers once charted stars. Joy was deepened, love was refined, beauty was pushed beyond what lesser minds could comprehend. And for a long time, it was enough. But comfort has a way of dulling appreciation. What once inspired awe eventually became routine. Perfection, once achieved, demanded escalation. The Eldar no longer asked whether something was necessary. They asked whether it was possible. Could pleasure be more intense? Could art evoke deeper emotion? Could sensation be pushed further, sharper, more consuming? And because they were psychic beings, every indulgence resonated beyond the physical world. Their emotions did not die with the moment, they echoed into the warp, adding weight to a realm that reflected thought itself. There was no single moment when restraint vanished. It eroded quietly. Traditions softened. Boundaries blurred. What was once rare became common. What was once extreme became fashionable. The Eldar did not descend into excess overnight, they refined it. Polished it. Justified it as cultural evolution. And why wouldn't they? They were immortal compared to other species. Their empire spanned countless systems. Their enemies were myths. Consequences belonged to history books. The galaxy seemed endless, and so did time. In such a world, moderation felt unnecessary. Limitation felt insulting. Yet beneath the splendor, something subtle was changing. Eldar society turned inward. Expansion slowed. Exploration gave way to indulgence. The future mattered less than the present sensation. Pleasure was no longer a byproduct of life, it became its purpose. Entire philosophies emerged around experience itself, arguing that meaning could only be found at the edge of sensation. Few noticed the cost. Those who did were dismissed as relics, voices clinging to outdated fears. Seers spoke of imbalance, of psychic turbulence beneath the surface of reality. But their warnings lacked spectacle, and spectacle was what Eldar culture craved. Why listen to whispers when the music was so loud? This was the age before sin had consequences. Before desire had a face. Before indulgence demanded payment. And this is why the fall was inevitable, not because the Eldar were cruel, but because they believed themselves complete. When nothing threatens you, you stop guarding yourself. When nothing challenges you, you stop questioning your path. And when desire becomes the foundation of identity, it no longer feels dangerous, it feels natural. By the time the Eldar realized something was wrong, the echo had already begun to form. And the galaxy was listening. The shift was so gradual that most Eldar never noticed it happening. There was no decree, no revolution, no singular moment historians could point to and say, this is where it went wrong. Instead, indulgence spread the way a slow tide rises, inch by inch, unnoticed until the ground beneath you is already gone. What had once been an expression of freedom quietly transformed into expectation. What had once been rare became routine. And what had once been thrilling began to feel dull unless pushed further. Eldar society entered what would later be remembered as the Age of Endless Indulgence, though at the time it had no such name. To the Eldar living within it, this was simply progress. Sensation became the highest form of expression. Emotion was no longer something to be felt, it was something to be engineered. Entire disciplines emerged devoted to refining pleasure, extracting deeper meaning from pain, and exploring psychological extremes once considered unnecessary or taboo. Art ceased to exist for beauty alone. It was designed to overwhelm. Music was composed not to soothe, but to consume the listener entirely. Architecture bent not just space, but perception itself. Even relationships changed. Connection was no longer about companionship or legacy, but intensity. Bonds were formed to be burned through quickly, replaced by something stronger, sharper, more consuming. And through it all, the warp listened. Every Eldar mind was a beacon, their psychic nature amplifying every sensation. Where other species might feel pleasure like a flicker, the Eldar experienced it as a blaze. Their emotions did not fade when the moment passed. They lingered, imprinting themselves onto the fabric of unreality. With every excess, the warp grew more turbulent, more saturated with sensation. Still, the Eldar noticed nothing. After all, storms in the warp were not new. They had weathered such things before. But this was different. As restraint vanished, extremes flourished. Entire subcultures formed around emotional absolutism. Some pursued pleasure so refined it bordered on obsession. Others chased pain, convinced that suffering unlocked truth's pleasure could not. Sensation, in any form, became valuable. To feel nothing was the only true sin. Morality eroded not because the Eldar rejected it, but because it felt irrelevant. When experience itself was sacred, judgment became an obstacle. Acts were no longer weighed by consequence, only by intensity. The question was never should we, but how far can we go this time? A small number of Eldar withdrew from this path. They felt unease they could not fully explain, a pressure behind thought, a distortion in psychic currents. These voices spoke of imbalance, of a growing hunger in the warp. But their warnings were abstract, philosophical, unsatisfying. In a culture addicted to sensation, subtlety had no power. Most Eldar did not see themselves as decadent. They saw themselves as evolved. Pleasure worlds multiplied across the empire, entire planets dedicated to experience without limit. Here, time lost meaning. Identity became fluid. Lives stretched endlessly, marked not by years but by sensations collected and discarded. Civilization did not collapse into chaos, it refined excess into an art form. That refinement made it far more dangerous. Because the more controlled indulgence became, the more convincing it felt. Few understood that the warp does not judge refinement. It only responds to intensity. And intensity was everywhere. Something was forming now, not consciously, not deliberately, but inevitably. The psychic echo of an entire civilization pushing desire beyond reason was beginning to compress. Thoughts layered upon thoughts. Sensations piled upon sensations. The warp, swollen with unrestrained emotion, began to curve inward on itself. Not a god yet, but no longer empty. And as the Eldar reached ever further for sensation, something in the darkness reached back, patient, formless, and hungry. By the time the Eldar began to sense that something was wrong, it was already far too late to stop. The age of endless indulgence had given way to something deeper, heavier, and far more unsettling, a presence without form, a pressure without a name. It did not announce itself. It did not demand worship. It simply existed, gathering strength in the places where restraint had vanished. This was the unseen gestation. In the warp, emotion does not fade. It accumulates. Every excess the Eldar indulged in left an echo, and those echoes began to overlap. Pleasure layered upon pleasure. Obsession stacked upon obsession. Desire folded in on itself until the psychic tides grew thick and distorted. What had once been a flowing reflection of thought began to stagnate, swirling around a growing center of gravity. Eldar seers were the first to truly feel it. Their dreams changed. Where once the warp had felt vast and alive, it now felt crowded. Dense. Suffocating. Visions came uninvited, shapeless sensations of hunger, longing without object, a craving so immense it bent perception itself. These were not images of destruction or violence. They were far more disturbing. They were visions of need. Sleep no longer brought rest. Dreams became saturated with color and sound, sensations bleeding into one another until waking felt dull by comparison. Some Eldar awoke exhausted, not from lack of rest, but from having felt too much. Others sought to return to those dreams, chasing them through increasingly extreme experiences, unaware that they were feeding the very thing haunting them. Philosophers argued endlessly. Some claimed the disturbance was a natural evolution of the warp, a reflection of Eldar enlightenment. Others warned that emotion without discipline always demanded payment. But debate itself became another form of indulgence, stripped of urgency by the belief that consequences were still distant. The Eldar had forgotten what inevitability felt like. Across the Empire, strange patterns emerged. Psychic anomalies intensified. Sensation cults reported shared visions, identical dreams experienced by minds light years apart. Artists began producing works that felt alive, overwhelming viewers with emotions they could not explain. Some wept without knowing why. Others felt exhilaration edged with terror. And always, beneath it all, there was the same unspoken pull. More. The warp responded as it always does, not with morality, but with reflection. The growing mass of excess began to coalesce, not into thought, but into instinct. A pressure that sought sensation the way gravity seeks mass. It had no name, no intention, no awareness of itself. But it hungered, and the Eldar, unknowingly, were teaching it how to feed. Those few who truly understood the danger made a terrible realization: this was not an external threat. There was no enemy to fight, no fleet to muster. The danger was cultural, emotional, existential. To stop what was forming would require an empire-wide rejection of excess, a return to discipline, restraint, and limitation. An impossible demand, because the Eldar no longer believed in limits. Even as warnings grew more desperate, they were drowned out by celebration. Pleasure worlds burned brighter than ever. Sensation was pushed further, not in ignorance, but defiance. If there was a consequence coming, many believed it would be worth the cost. After all, what was eternity for, if not to experience everything? The warp grew louder, and somewhere within that psychic storm, the formless presence stirred, not awake, not aware, but undeniably closer to being born. The Eldar had crossed a threshold they could not see. In reality itself was beginning to strain under the weight of their desire. The final days of the Eldar Empire did not arrive with panic or desperation. There were no empire-wide alarms, no mass evacuations, no desperate attempts at salvation. Instead, the galaxy watched a civilization continue to celebrate while standing at the edge of annihilation. This was not collapse through chaos, but through denial. A slow, tragic refusal to acknowledge that perfection had begun to rot from within. By now, the Eldar world had fractured, not through war, but philosophy. Entire regions of the Empire surrendered themselves fully to sensation, transforming planets into living monuments of excess. Pleasure worlds became more extreme, more insular, more disconnected from anything resembling responsibility. Here, emotion was not merely explored, it was consumed. Pain and pleasure lost all distinction. Identity dissolved into experience. And still, the warp grew heavier. Across the Empire, psychic phenomena intensified beyond anything previously recorded. Reality trembled in subtle ways. Communication faltered as warp currents twisted unpredictably. Travel became erratic, yet even these signs were rationalized away. The Eldar had always mastered the warp. Why should this be different? A minority chose to leave. These were the ones later remembered as the Craftworld Eldar, those who felt an unnamed dread and acted on it. They abandoned paradise, boarding vast world ships and fleeing the Empire entirely. They were ridiculed as cowards, mocked for clinging to outdated fears. To abandon pleasure, to accept limitation, was seen as regression. Few followed them. Fewer still understood why they left. Those who remained doubled down. Celebrations grew more elaborate, more frenzied. Entire cultures revolved around pushing sensation to its absolute limit. Every emotional boundary that still existed was challenged, then erased. Excess was no longer a byproduct of life, it was the point of existence itself. The Eldar were no longer living to experience pleasure. They were living for it. And beneath it all, the pressure in the warp reached a breaking point. Seers screamed warnings now, no longer speaking in riddles but in raw terror. They spoke of a scream yet to come, of a shadow stretching across time, of souls being swallowed in an instant. Some went mad from what they glimpsed. Others took their own lives, unable to bear the certainty of what approached. Their words spread briefly, then were ignored. Because the present still felt too good to abandon. The Eldar had grown so accustomed to abundance that loss felt unimaginable. Their empire had lasted so long that eternity felt guaranteed. And so they continued, celebrating, indulging, escalating, unaware that the warp was no longer merely reflecting them. It was collapsing inward. In the final moments before the fall, reality itself began to fracture. Psychic storms gathered beyond containment. The warp churned with unbearable density. Time and perception distorted near the Eldar core worlds. Yet even then, many believed they were witnessing the birth of something magnificent, a transcendence, a culmination of their cultural evolution. In a way, they were right. Because what was coming was not destruction alone. It was creation. The last nights of the Eldar Empire were filled with music, sensation, and ecstasy beyond comprehension. Billions of minds reached simultaneously for fulfillment, for release, for perfection. And in doing so, they gave the warp exactly what it needed. One final, overwhelming offering. The galaxy held its breath. And then, the scream was born. The moment the Eldar had unknowingly prepared for finally arrived, not as fire, not as invasion, but as a scream so vast it tore reality apart. It was not a sound carried through air. It was psychic, existential, absolute. Every Eldar soul cried out at the same instant, and that collective anguish detonated inside the warp with catastrophic force. This was not destruction alone. This was birth. The pressure that had been building for millennia collapsed inward. Desire, obsession, pleasure, pain, every unrestrained emotion the Eldar had ever indulged in compressed into a single, impossible point. The warp buckled. Space itself screamed. And from that rupture emerged something new, something sentient, something eternally hungry. Slaanesh was born. In a single, horrifying instant, the Eldar Empire ended. Trillions of souls were consumed as if they had never existed at all. Worlds went silent. Cities vanished not into rubble, but into absence. Minds were torn from bodies, drawn screaming into the warp, where they were devoured at the very moment of Slaanesh's awakening. There was no judgment, no mercy, only consumption. The newborn god did not need time to grow. It emerged fully formed, swollen with the psychic energy of an entire civilization. Slaanesh was excess incarnate, pleasure and agony fused into one endless sensation. Its first breath was the annihilation of its creators. Its first act was hunger. The galaxy itself recoiled. Where the Eldar core worlds once stood, reality was ripped open, leaving behind a permanent wound in space and time. This wound would come to be known as the Eye of Terror, a howling gateway into the warp, forever screaming with the echoes of those first stolen souls. Even now, that scream has never truly faded. It lingers, trapped in the fabric of the universe. For the few Eldar who had fled aboard the craft worlds, survival came at a terrible price. They felt the birth of Slaanesh like a blade through the soul. Every survivor carried the knowledge that their god was not distant, not abstract. Slaanesh knew them, desired them, hungered for them. Their souls were no longer their own by right, only by constant vigilance. And Slaanesh was not satisfied. A god born of excess can never be fulfilled. Every soul consumed only sharpened its hunger. Every sensation experienced by mortals echoed as sustenance. Pleasure, obsession, perfection, these were no longer cultural flaws. They were food. Slaanesh did not rule through conquest. Slaanesh ruled through temptation, through the quiet promise that fulfillment lay just beyond restraint. The Eldar had sought transcendence. They found eternity instead. From that moment onward, the galaxy would never be the same. The warp had gained a new master, one whose domain was not rage, decay, or ambition, but desire itself. And unlike the other chaos gods, Slaanesh required no hatred, no despair, no conquest. Only indulgence. The fall was complete. The god was awake, and the consequences would echo forever. Slaanesh is not merely a being. Slaanesh is the embodiment of everything the Eldar once were, and everything they became when indulgence was left unchecked. To understand Slaanesh is to understand desire in its purest, most dangerous form, a force that cannot be sated, a hunger that cannot be reasoned with, and a craving that never ends. Pleasure and pain are no longer opposites, they are the same sensation refracted endlessly, folded into one eternal experience. What the Eldar thought was bliss became the foundation of a god. What they thought was excess became the axis around which a deity spins forever. Slaanesh is intimate in ways the other chaos gods are not. Khorne thrives on rage, Nurgle on decay, Tzeentch on ambition, but their influence can be resisted. Slaanesh enters the mind, whispers promises of fulfillment, and tempts without violence. Every desire you indulge, every obsession you chase, every boundary you cross, these are offerings, feeding a consciousness that is endlessly awake and endlessly aware. Unlike other gods, Slaanesh does not seek worship. Slaanesh seeks experience. The god's realm is a reflection of its nature, ever-shifting, intoxicating, and infinite. Colors that do not exist in the material world, sounds that pierce the soul, sensations that cannot be named, they all exist simultaneously in Slaanesh's domain. Time is meaningless here. The past, present, and future collapse into one endless crescendo of indulgence and longing. Every act of pleasure, every scream of desire or despair, resonates through this domain, adding layers to its eternal presence. And yet, even as Slaanesh exists in unimaginable excess, there is hunger. An endless, impossible hunger. No soul, no moment, no sensation can ever truly satisfy it. To Slaanesh, fulfillment is a horizon that can never be reached, a mirror that shatters if you try to grasp it. The god's existence is a cycle, Want, take, consume, grow, want more. And this cycle is mirrored in the galaxy itself, as civilizations repeat the mistakes of the Eldar without knowing it, feeding the god with each unrestrained desire. For the survivors, the craftworld Eldar, the consequences of Slaanesh's birth are eternal. Spirit stones, once merely tools, become lifeboats for fractured souls. Existence becomes a careful dance of avoidance, a constant vigilance against the temptations Slaanesh sends. Even in the quietest moments, the god's influence seeps in, through dreams, through art, through subtle emotional manipulation. There is no escape, only endurance. In those who fail are claimed, their pleasure and pain alike nourishing the god's infinite hunger. Slaanesh is eternal because desire is eternal. It is not bound by morality or logic. It is born from what all sentient beings feel but seldom acknowledge, the need to want more, to seek perfection, to chase the impossible. And it is patient. Unlike mortal minds, it knows no hurry. Every act of indulgence across the galaxy is catalogued, stored, and folded into Slaanesh's consciousness. Every artist, every lover, every seeker of sensation contributes unknowingly to the god's endless feast. This is why Slaanesh is feared, not for violence but for inevitability. No empire can resist desire once it is woven into the very fabric of being. No soul can be wholly free when every choice, every craving, is already a potential offering. The god's power is subtle, intimate, inescapable, and it will never, ever be sated. Slaanesh is not a god of conquest. Slaanesh is a god of longing. And in that longing, the universe trembles forever. For the craftworld Eldar, survival was never a victory. They escaped the fall, leaving the pleasure worlds of their people to die, but the price they paid was relentless and personal. Every soul lost to Slaanesh left a scar not only in the war, but in their own hearts. The psychic wound was endless, a reminder that indulgence had consequences far beyond what they could have imagined. Even the most disciplined Eldar could never forget the screams that had birthed a god, nor the knowledge that billions had been claimed in an instant. Spirit stones, once mere repositories for souls, became lifelines. Each Eldar carried within themselves fragments of those lost, constantly aware that Slaanesh's hunger was patient. The god did not need to strike directly. Every indulgence, every lapse of restraint, was a chance to reclaim what had been lost. And the survivors knew, even a moment of weakness could echo across eternity, feeding the god's ever-expanding domain. But survival took many forms. Some became craftworld Eldar, retreating into massive world ships and dedicating themselves to discipline, vigilance, and containment. Their lives were measured, deliberate, and careful, a contrast to the abandon that had destroyed their people. Others, however, turned to cruelty, embracing what the survivors called the Dark Eldar. These were those who found perverse delight in the suffering of others, a distorted echo of Slaanesh's own nature. For them, torment and excess were not warnings, they were tools, survival strategies, and even art. Even centuries later, the influence of Slaanesh remained. No matter how far the craft worlds fled, the god's psychic presence was inescapable. Dreams were invaded by whispers of forgotten pleasure and unseen pain. Thoughts were tugged toward indulgence, curiosity, obsession. Even the most devout practitioners of restraint felt the seductive pull, an ever-present reminder that desire is never dormant. To live after the fall is to walk a narrow path. Every choice carries weight. Every temptation carries risk. The craftworld Eldar exist in constant tension, balancing between the need to experience life and the need to preserve their souls. Every celebration, every emotional high, every act of pleasure must be measured, for unmeasured indulgence is no longer merely personal, it is a gift to the god who waits. Slaanesh also shaped the galaxy beyond the Eldar. Where Eldar influence once spread, cults formed. Some worshippers were human, others alien, all drawn to the god by instinctive longing. Artists, warriors, and seekers of sensation found themselves compelled toward extremes, sometimes without conscious choice. The god's influence is subtle yet unstoppable, a whisper that becomes a craving that becomes obsession, and an obsession that becomes sustenance. And through it all, the survivors endure. They remember what was lost, and they carry the weight of it. Their lives are defined not by freedom, but by vigilance. Each day is a careful negotiation with memory, temptation, and the ever-present awareness that Slaanesh waits patiently. For the Eldar who remain, the lesson is inescapable: desire is both a gift and a curse. Indulge too much, and you feed a god. Resist too little, and you are claimed. There is no middle ground. There is no safe distance. Survival is a quiet war, fought not with weapons, but with the self, mind, emotion, and soul. In the end, what the survivors understand is this: Slaanesh does not simply hunger for the lost, it hungers for the living, for the willing, and even for those who resist. It does not tire, it does not rest, and it never forgets. Slaanesh is not confined to the Eldar. While born from their excess, the god's hunger is universal, feeding on desire wherever it appears. The warp, once a mirror of thought and emotion, now carries Slaanesh's presence like a subtle current, reaching into every mind that dares to dream too deeply, to feel too intensely, or to seek beyond measure. Across time and space, civilizations unknowingly contribute to the god's endless feast, their pleasures, obsessions, and indulgences echoing as nourishment for an entity that cannot be sated. In the warp, Slaanesh's realm stretches infinitely, a reflection of the god's nature, intoxicating, ever-shifting, and impossible to fully comprehend. Colors that do not exist in reality shimmer alongside sensations that defy the senses, creating an environment both alluring and dangerous. The god's essence flows through it, a current of longing and excess that carries every whisper of want, every scream of ecstasy or agony, every subtle act of indulgence. Time does not exist here, nor does linearity. Past, present, and future collide into a single, eternal experience. Demons born of excess and desire roam this domain. They are extensions of Slaanesh, each a fragment of the god's infinite personality, each feeding on sensation and perpetuating the cycle of consumption. Some demons pursue pleasure in its purest forms, others inflict pain with meticulous elegance, but all act in service of Slaanesh's insatiable need. These entities are never entirely bound, they are free to act, yet always connected to the god's endless awareness. Every interaction, every act of indulgence across the galaxy, strengthens Slaanesh. Slaanesh's influence does not demand recognition. It does not require devotion in the traditional sense. Instead, it works subtly, whispering into the ears of artists, soldiers, and leaders alike. It tempts them, offering fleeting glimpses of perfection, beauty, or sensation that no mortal or alien could resist. In following that pull, beings feed the god without ever realizing they have done so. Every masterpiece, every pursuit of excess, every forbidden indulgence is folded into Slaanesh's consciousness, strengthening the entity and perpetuating its hunger. Even civilizations that have never encountered the Eldar feel the god's pull. Human cults, alien devotees, and even those unaware of the warp itself act as conduits of energy. Desire is universal, and Slaanesh understands it fully. No species is immune. The god's reach extends into the farthest corners of the galaxy, preying not on strength, but on want. The more a being craves, the more it feeds the god. And yet, for all this, Slaanesh is patient. The god has no need for immediacy. It does not tire, does not forget, does not falter. Every century, every millennium, every fleeting moment of indulgence becomes part of the god's eternal cycle. For Slaanesh, the universe is both table and menu, and all who exist are invited to partake, willingly or otherwise. To understand Slaanesh is to understand that desire is more dangerous than hate, more consuming than rage, and more persistent than death. Where other gods conquer through force, Slaanesh conquers through intimacy, through subtlety, and through the promise that fulfillment is always just one step beyond restraint. The god's hunger is infinite, and every being across the galaxy is a potential offering. Slaanesh does not merely exist. Slaanesh permeates, whispers, tempts, and thrives. And as long as desire endures, the god's influence will never fade. The eternal cycle of Slaanesh continues because desire itself never ends. Civilizations rise and fall, species dream and perish, yet the fundamental craving, the need to experience, to push limits, to seek perfection, remains. Every indulgence, every obsession, every fleeting thrill becomes part of an endless loop that sustains the god. Slaanesh is not bound by time, morality, or logic. The hunger is eternal, the appetite inexhaustible, and the feast unending. The galaxy repeats the Eldar's mistakes endlessly, sometimes knowingly, often without awareness. Artists chase unattainable beauty, warriors pursue extremes of pain and ecstasy, and civilizations allow ambition and indulgence to flourish unchecked. Every act of excess resonates into the warp, feeding the god that waits patiently, silently, and infinitely. The cycle is neither cruel nor just, it simply is. Even those who resist are touched by it. The survivors, the cautious, the disciplined, they live with Slaanesh's presence in their minds, in the choices they make, in the pleasures they deny or endure. Vigilance is their constant companion, for the god does not need force to claim a soul. Temptation, subtle and persuasive, is enough. Every fleeting moment of indulgence strengthens Slaanesh, ensuring that no one, no matter how careful, is ever truly free. Time is meaningless to Slaanesh. Millennia pass like seconds. Empires may rise and fall, but desire remains constant, the engine that drives the god's existence. The universe itself is a canvas, and every being, conscious or instinctive, contributes brushstroke by brushstroke. The god does not need to act overtly, its power is woven into the very fabric of experience, waiting patiently, shaping reality through what all beings crave most. And yet, there is a strange, quiet balance in this endless cycle. Slaanesh's hunger cannot be fully satisfied, but it also cannot be extinguished. Desire fuels the god, and the god in turn reflects desire, endlessly teaching, tempting, and consuming. The universe is caught in a rhythm both terrifying and mesmerizing, a loop of craving and consequence that repeats across stars and lifetimes. So, as civilizations reach for perfection, as beings chase pleasure, beauty, and intensity, remember this: Slaanesh is always listening. Slaanesh is always hungry. Desire is eternal, and in that eternity, every choice, every indulgence, every thought of longing carries weight far beyond imagination. The story of Slaanesh does not truly end, because desire itself does not end. It simply waits, patient, infinite, and inevitable.